Hello, welcome to week 5 of our course. I look forward to working with you during this week. During week 5, we will be examining the period of the 1960s and the 1970s in American history. One topic that we will be focusing on significantly is the Watergate scandal. A second topic that we will be examining is the conservative reaction to the counterculture in the 1960s and 1970s. You do have 2 assignments to complete for this week. One is the discussion board. The discussion board question relates to Watergate. And you also have, you're asked to complete a 200 to 400 word short essay or blog, as you have been in previous weeks as well. The short essay deals with the rise of conservatism in the 1960s and 1970s. The Watergate scandal is a very interesting aspect of American history. Richard Nixon is an interesting political figure. Richard Nixon was a Republican. He served in Congress in the 1950s. He served as Vice President of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s. He gained his reputation largely as a result of the investigation of communism. Nixon was involved in efforts to investigate communist spies within the United States government. He ran for president in 1960 against John F. Kennedy. He was defeated in one of the closest elections in American history. And Richard Nixon developed a fairly hostile relationship with the press during the election campaign of 1960. He felt that the press was unfair to him and favored John F. Kennedy. And Nixon announced that he was retiring from politics in 1960. He said that the press wouldn't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. Nixon became involved again in politics in the later 1960s, and he ran for president again in 1968. 1968 was one of the most contentious election campaigns in American history. Lyndon Johnson had announced that he would not seek a second term in office. President Johnson would not seek re-election largely to the disaster of the Vietnam War. Hubert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, sought the Democratic nomination on a largely pro-war platform. He was challenged by Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother, for the Democratic nomination. Tragically, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, was killed. So Hubert Humphrey ultimately gained the Democratic nomination for president on, again, a largely pro-Vietnam War platform. There are massive protests going on against the Vietnam War at this point. Richard Nixon campaigned and secured the Republican nomination for president. Nixon said that he had a secret plan to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, but he could not reveal the details of this plan. So Nixon, he did not want to surrender in Vietnam or withdraw from Vietnam, but he also believed that there needed to be some kind of exit strategy to get the United States out of Vietnam. Nixon won the election. He served his first term in office, and he sought re-election in 1972. In 1972, Nixon wanted to know more about the Democratic Party's strategy against him. Nixon was somewhat paranoid. He believed that the press was out to get him. He was very concerned about what he referred to as his political enemies. He kept an enemies list, which is rather unusual. Nixon didn't really trust the agencies of government. He believed that many of the agencies of government, the national security agencies, the FBI, were also conspiring against him. So he kept a very small inner circle of advisors who he communicated with, including Henry Kissinger. Nixon runs for re-election in 1972. The Vietnam War is still ongoing, though the number of American soldiers in the war have been drawn down substantially, and the number of U.S. casualties has been reduced significantly by this point. Nixon orders his own group of investigators, if you will, to gather information about the Democratic Party and its campaign strategy. This was, of course, illegal. This group was popularly known as the Plumbers because they quote-unquote fixed leaks. One of the roles of the Plumbers was to find out who was leaking information from federal agencies that was critical of Nixon or made Nixon look bad. And the Plumbers engaged in lots of illegal actions. In this instance, the Plumbers organized a break-in of the Watergate complex, which was where the Democratic National Committee's election headquarters was located. A group of men broke into the Watergate complex, wiretapped the phones of the Democratic National Committee, and were caught by security and arrested. This was ultimately, over time, traced back to Richard Nixon. The press did a great deal of investigative reporting on this, and it became increasingly clear as more and more revelations were made that Nixon, if he had not known about this beforehand, certainly knew about it afterwards and sought to cover it up. And that the individuals involved in the break-in were people essentially working for Richard Nixon and his campaign. So this was a felony that Nixon was involved in and complicit in. Nixon tried everything possible to cover this up. He fired attorney generals who were investigating him. He tried to suppress evidence. Ultimately, it was revealed that all of the conversations in the White House were recorded for posterity, for history on tapes. The Supreme Court ruled that these tapes needed to be released to reveal if Nixon had been involved in this Watergate plot. More and more evidence accrued demonstrating that Nixon was deeply involved in the cover-up of the Watergate break-in. Nixon had won re-election overwhelmingly in 1972. Ultimately, Nixon was impeached by the House of Representatives, meaning that the House of Representatives filed formal charges against Nixon, asserting that he had committed high crimes and misdemeanors in relation to the Watergate break-in. It was up to the Senate to vote whether to remove Richard Nixon from office or not. It became clear ultimately that the Senate would vote to remove him from office. In order to avoid this, Nixon resigned. He stepped down from office before the Senate formally voted to remove him from office. He's the only president in American history to be essentially forced out of office by the impeachment process. A few other presidents have been impeached. Andrew Johnson, during Reconstruction, was impeached, but not removed from office. Bill Clinton was impeached, but not removed from office in the 1990s. One of the interesting aspects of the Watergate scandal, in addition to the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal eroded the American people's faith in government. People became very distrustful of government, and I think with good reason. Watergate, Nixon had lied repeatedly to try to cover up Watergate. Nixon was involved in a variety of illegal activities. it's not surprising that the American people lost faith in government as a result. And I'm not sure that that faith in government has ever fully been restored. The government also was presenting a lot of disinformation related to the war in Vietnam during this period, which caused a lot of mistrust in government as well. There's been more news about Nixon recently. Evidence has been revealed that suggests that during his first election campaign in 1968, Nixon was in contact with officials in Vietnam and was discouraging the South Vietnamese government from engaging in peace talks. Nixon knew that if the war was going badly and seemed to have no end in sight, that it would be more likely that he would win the election. So Nixon's campaign was in contact with the South Vietnamese government, urging them not to participate in any peace talks or to thwart any peace talks that took place in 1968. This also would have been a violation of federal law. It was not revealed, though, until much later, long after Nixon's presidency and, in fact, death. The other topic that you're exploring this week is the rise of conservatism in the 60s. This might seem like a strange topic. The 60s, when we think of the 60s, we tend to think of the hippie movement, the countercultural revolution, and think of it as a very sort of radical or at least liberal period in American history. There certainly was a vast countercultural movement, and the hippie subculture was very prominent in especially the mid to late 1960s. One interesting thing to consider, though, is that the counterculture and the youth movement and the hippie counterculture did spark a reaction against itself. It did bring about a conservative reaction against liberalism. Conservatism's re-emerged with prominence in the 1960s. Barry Goldwater famously ran for president as a Republican in 1964 as really the first modern conservative candidate, if you will. During this period, also Ronald Reagan emerged in prominence as a conservative political leader and was elected governor of California during this period as well. Of course, later he would become president. Reagan did seek the Republican nomination in a campaign against actually Richard Nixon in 1968, but he failed to secure the Republican nomination. He would run against Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination. So Nixon was emerging as a conservative figure, and Barry Goldwater was a conservative figure as well. So the conservative movement was beginning to emerge. So I hope that this brief introduction is helpful, and I look forward to working with you during this week. Thank you very much.